Russia did not see it coming. Nobody did. For months, the southern front had been a slow, grinding nightmare for Ukraine. Russian forces were advancing methodically, eating through Ukrainian defensive positions week after week, kilometer by kilometer, with the kind of relentless pressure that grinds armies into dust. And then, in less than 168 hours, in less than one single week, everything collapsed. Not for Ukraine, for Russia. That is the story we are breaking down today, and by the time we are done, you will understand exactly why what happened in Zaporizhzhia in early February 2026 is not just a military event. It is a strategic earthquake that has shaken the Kremlin to its core and forced Russian commanders into the one position they feared most: retreat. Let us go back to the beginning of February 2026. The picture on the southern front was grim. Russia had been running a 9-brigade push toward Zaporizhzhia city since the summer of 2025. 9 brigades. Think about what that means. That is not a skirmish force. That is a concentrated, sustained military campaign designed to capture one of Ukraine's most strategically vital cities. By December 2025, Russian forces had captured Huliaipole, a critical logistical node sitting roughly 80 kilometers east of Zaporizhzhia city itself. Under 400 daily artillery strikes, Ukraine had retreated from 5 towns in the region. The path toward Zaporizhzhia city was looking dangerously open. And 700,000 civilians were in the crosshairs. On paper, Russia was winning the south. It was not just winning. It was advancing toward a prize that would reshape the entire war. Here is what you need to understand about Zaporizhzhia to grasp why this matters so deeply. The city sits on the Dnipro River. It is Ukraine's 6th largest city. It is the gateway to Crimea and the land bridge that sustains Russia's entire southern military operation. And to the south of the city sits the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, the largest nuclear facility in Europe, a structure that Russian forces have been using as a strategic shield for nearly 4 years. If Russian tube artillery ever got close enough to the city, the consequences would not simply be military. They would be catastrophic in every dimension: humanitarian, political, psychological, global. The world would be staring at a potential nuclear crisis in the middle of a war that already has every major power on edge. This is the stakes we are talking about. This is the reason that what Ukraine pulled off in early February 2026 is so extraordinary. Ukraine did not just stop a Russian advance, Ukraine blew up Russia's entire strategic timetable for the south. And here is where it gets really interesting. Because the operation did not begin with tanks and artillery. It began with a laptop and a cyber operation that caught Russian forces completely off guard. Ukrainian intelligence units identified something that most of the world still has not fully appreciated. Russian troops had been illegally mounting Starlink terminals on attack drones and using the network for battlefield communications. Starlink, the satellite internet system operated by SpaceX, had become an unofficial backbone of Russian tactical communications in sectors where their own military systems were unreliable or had been degraded. And Russia had been doing this in direct violation of Starlink's terms of service and international agreements. From the very first days of February 2026, Ukraine's defense ministry and SpaceX cooperated to cut off that unauthorized access entirely. Russian forces lost their Starlink connectivity overnight. Just like that, the effect was immediate, and by all accounts, devastating. According to a Ukrainian military expert speaking to Ukrainian national news, the degradation of Russian communication systems was more significant than anyone had anticipated. His exact assessment? He expected it would be a problem for the Russians, but did not assume the consequences would be so severe. When Starlink went dark, Russian soldiers were forced to manually repair field communication cables in the middle of an active battlefield. Fiber optic lines that had been laid hastily had to be found, identified, and repaired by hand, under fire, in freezing conditions, while Ukrainian eyes were watching every move. Their drone operations, which had been a central pillar of Russian tactical effectiveness on this front, collapsed. Command and control fractured, units lost coherence, and Ukrainian forces, who had been watching and waiting, recognized the window immediately. This was their moment. But the cyber operation did not stop there. And this is the part that should make every military analyst pay attention. A Ukrainian intelligence unit collected identification data and terminal coordinates from Russian soldiers who attempted to reactivate their Starlink terminals after the initial blackout. Think about the discipline required for that. Ukrainian cyber operators were not just cutting the signal, they were running an active intelligence collection operation in real time, harvesting data from desperate Russian soldiers trying to restore communications. 2,420 data packets were transferred to Ukrainian law enforcement and defense agencies. The terminals were then locked in what is called brick mode, permanently and irreversibly disabled. The world's second-largest army, as Moscow loves to describe itself, was left scrambling to fix cables with their bare hands in a war zone. That is not military power. That is a system in freefall. Now, a communication blackout alone does not retake territory. What happened next required boots on the ground, steel nerves, and elite Ukrainian units executing with near-perfect coordination across multiple axes simultaneously. Let us talk about the ground operation, because this is where the story becomes truly remarkable. At the center of the Ukrainian counterattack was the 225th Separate Assault Regiment. These are not regular infantry. These are assault specialists trained for exactly the kind of rapid, high-tempo operations that expose an enemy who has lost the ability to communicate effectively. Near the village of Ulyanivka and the surrounding settlements, the 225th executed what can only be described as a textbook ambush operation. Assault teams cleared Russian positions in 2 villages in rapid succession. In a single day, they neutralized 40 Russian soldiers. That number alone should tell you something about the tempo and ferocity of these operations. But the most remarkable moment came in the village of Staromayorske. Elements of the regiment penetrated Russian defensive positions, took prisoners, transported them alive, searched them, and evacuated them to safe areas in strict accordance with the Geneva Conventions. In the fog and chaos of modern drone warfare, Ukrainian soldiers were making deliberate choices to spare the lives of Russians who surrendered. That level of discipline and professionalism, under fire, under pressure, speaks volumes about the quality of these units and the command culture they operate under. The key to the 225th's success was the Black Swan Strike Group, a specialized unit operating within the regiment structure that coordinates UAV pilots and infantry assault teams in real time. This is the kind of innovation that has characterized Ukrainian military adaptation throughout this war. In sectors where Russian positions showed inadequate electronic warfare protection, and after the Starlink blackout there were many such sectors, UAVs conducted preliminary strikes, mapping out Russian positions and carving out safe corridors for the infantry to advance through. Ukrainian assault teams were reaching Russian positions with almost no casualties, almost 0 losses. Think about what that means in a war where both sides have been grinding each other down for years, where casualty rates have been brutal on both sides, and where every meter of ground has been paid for in blood. And here is where it gets even more impressive. Ukraine's 475th Independent Assault Regiment was operating in parallel, exploiting precise intelligence with an entirely different category of drone technology: fiber optic-controlled UAVs. This technology deserves a moment of explanation because it is a genuine game-changer. Fiber optic control means the drone signal cannot be jammed by electronic warfare systems. It does not rely on radio frequencies that can be detected, disrupted, or spoofed. It is physically immune to the jamming that has neutralized so many conventional drones on both sides throughout this war. The signal travels through a thin fiber optic cable, spooling out behind the drone as it flies. No radio signature, no exploitable frequency, no countermeasure currently in Russia's field arsenal that can stop it. The 475th used these unjammable drones to carve out trench corridors 4 to 5 kilometers deep inside Russian-held territory. Those corridors were then used to flush Russian troops from fortified forest positions that Moscow had been preparing for months as the launching pad for its summer 2026 offensive. Let me pause on that for a moment, because this is one of the most significant details in this entire operation. Russia's summer 2026 offensive in the south, the one that was supposed to push toward Zaporizhzhia city and threaten those 700,000 civilians, depended on specific staging positions that had been prepared over months at enormous cost in manpower and material. In 1 week, those positions were gone, overrun, destroyed. Not after a grinding 6-month campaign, but in 7 days. That is not a tactical success. That is a strategic disruption of the highest order. Meanwhile, the 33rd Separate Assault Regiment cleared the village of Kosivka on February 11, 2026. Street by street, building by building, this regiment's expertise in urban warfare came into full effect as they cleared Russian soldiers who had embedded themselves in residential structures, using civilian homes as fighting positions. This is the grim reality of this war. Every village is a fortress, every home a potential ambush point, and clearing them requires a level of skill and discipline that only the best-trained units possess. And then, the airborne forces arrived. The 82nd and 95th Airborne Brigades, both part of Ukraine's 7th Air Assault Corps, were redeployed from the Pokrovsk sector and pushed into the offensive line east of Zaporizhzhia. These are elite units built for speed, for rapid exploitation of gaps in enemy lines, for the kind of fast, mobile operations that turn a tactical breakthrough into a strategic route. The 82nd Brigade operated along the Zaliznichne to Novomikhailivka line. The 95th Brigade pushed up the eastern bank of the Mokry Yali River. Their rapid mobility was perfectly suited to exploiting the gaps created by the 225th and 475th, and together these units were able to advance across terrain that Russian forces had considered secured. Before we go any further, I want to take a moment to say something directly to you. If you are watching this channel, you already understand that the world does not explain itself. Events like what is happening in Zaporizhzhia do not come with instruction manuals. They come with noise and confusion and propaganda from every direction. This channel exists to cut through that noise and give you a real analysis, grounded in facts, stripped of spin. If this breakdown is giving you something to think about, hit that subscribe button right now and turn on notifications. Because every development on this front line matters, and we will be here to break it down every time. Now let us talk about one of the most specialized and least covered elements of this entire operation: the Iron Falcon strike team attached to the 95th Brigade. This unit operated with a level of operational security that meant almost no information about their methods leaked in real time. What we know is that they were responsible for deep strike missions targeting Russian command posts and logistics nodes far behind the front line. In the days following the initial Ukrainian push, Russian supply lines in the Zaporizhzhia sector were hit repeatedly and with precision. Ammunition depots, fuel storage points, forward command elements. The Iron Falcon team's operations ensured that even as Russian forces began to realize the scale of what was happening, they could not effectively reinforce or resupply the units that were collapsing under the Ukrainian assault. Operating in coordination with the Iron Falcon team was the Requiem Group, a unit whose name alone tells you something about the message they intended to send. The Requiem Group specialized in cutting supply lines at the tactical level, operating behind Russian lines to interdict the movement of reinforcements and supplies to the most contested sectors. In the critical days of the February operation, this group severed supply connections in multiple locations, creating a logistics void that left forward Russian units isolated, unable to retreat in good order, and unable to receive the ammunition and reinforcements they desperately needed. When you add the communication blackout from the Starlink cut, the deep strike operations by the Iron Falcon team, and the supply interdiction by the Requiem Group, you begin to understand that what Ukraine executed was not a simple counterattack. It was a sophisticated multi-domain operation that simultaneously degraded Russian command, communications, logistics, and frontline fighting capability. This was not improvised. This was planned, rehearsed, and executed with a level of operational art that even professional military analysts have acknowledged represents a significant evolution in Ukrainian capabilities. The results in terms of territory are striking. By mid-February 2026, Ukrainian forces had recaptured approximately 300 square kilometers of territory in the Zaporizhzhia Oblast. Let that number sink in. 300 square kilometers. 2 months of Russian hard-fought gains, bought at enormous cost in lives and material, erased in less than 7 days. At least 700 Russian soldiers were killed or captured in the operation. Dozens of armored vehicles were destroyed. Russian military equipment worth an estimated $60 to $70 million was scrapped, burned, or captured on the battlefield. And Russia's carefully prepared summer 2026 offensive positions were eliminated. Russian state media and the Kremlin's information apparatus went into overdrive. The standard playbook was deployed: deny, minimize, reframe. Russian military bloggers, who had spent weeks celebrating incremental advances in Zaporizhzhia, went quiet, or pivoted to argue that the Russian retreat was a planned regrouping rather than a forced withdrawal. But the satellite imagery does not lie. The drone footage does not lie. The geolocated position of Russian units after the operation tells the full story. Russian forces are now, in the words of Ukrainian military analyst Oleksandr Kovalenko and analysts at the Institute for the Study of War, spinning their wheels halfway back toward their intended staging positions. And here is the critical geopolitical context that makes all of this even more significant. Peace talks are actively ongoing. The United States, Ukraine, and Russia met in Geneva on February 26, 2026. U.S. Special Envoy Steve Witkoff and senior American diplomat Jared Kushner have been involved in trilateral negotiations. Russia is demanding formal recognition of the territory it currently occupies in Donetsk. Ukraine, under substantial pressure from Washington to offer concessions, has proposed a demilitarized zone as an alternative to outright territorial cession. And into this diplomatic pressure cooker, Ukraine's military has just demonstrated that it can strike with elite precision while simultaneously negotiating at the highest level. President Zelensky, speaking to AFP on February 20, 2026, said directly and without hesitation, "You cannot say that we are losing the war. Honestly, we are definitely not losing it. Definitely. The question is whether we will win." That statement did not come from a position of weakness. It came from a president who knew at that very moment that his soldiers were standing on 300 newly recaptured square kilometers of Ukrainian soil. Ukraine's negotiating position at the table is shaped entirely by what its soldiers achieve on the battlefield. And what they achieved in Zaporizhzhia in February 2026 was a demonstration of capability that no amount of diplomatic pressure, no economic leverage, and no friendly fire from allies can erase from the record. The Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, the largest in Europe, now finds itself in a slightly safer operational environment. Ukrainian forces having pushed Russian observation points and artillery further east means that the range of Russian systems capable of striking civilian infrastructure near the plant has been significantly reduced. This is not simply a military gain, it is a humanitarian one, a reduction in the immediate threat of a nuclear incident that has haunted this war since 2022. Every kilometer of buffer zone between Russian artillery and that plant is a kilometer that reduces the probability of a catastrophic accident or a deliberate act of nuclear blackmail. Let us also acknowledge the psychological dimension of this operation, because wars are not won only with weapons and territory. The morale of Ukrainian assault troops is visibly rising. It is visible in the footage released by these units. It is visible in the discipline with which they are treating prisoners according to international law. It is visible in the coordinated precision of operations that involved multiple elite units executing across multiple axes simultaneously without breaking formation or losing coherence. And on the Russian side, the opposite is true. Units that expected to be advancing are instead retreating. Units that expected reliable Starlink communications are instead repairing cables by hand in the snow under fire. Officers who were planning a summer offensive are instead trying to explain to their superiors why their lines collapsed in a week. For a tired army with fractured communications and severed supply lines, uncertainty is deadlier than bullets. That is not a metaphor. That is a principle of military science that has been proven on every battlefield in history. Now let us be direct, because intellectual honesty is what makes analysis worth anything. Ukraine did not defeat Russia in Zaporizhzhia. Russia still controls approximately 80% of Zaporizhzhia Oblast. This operation was not a full-scale counteroffensive. Ukraine's own military experts have been careful and precise in how they describe it. A counterattack, a stabilization operation, a strategic disruption. Ukraine currently lacks the troop strength, the air superiority, and the artillery depth required for a sustained, large-scale offensive push of the kind that would fundamentally change the map. What happened in February 2026 was brilliant, precise, and strategically significant. But it is a tactical achievement with strategic consequences, not an operational breakthrough of the kind that ends wars. And holding what was recaptured will now become the critical test. Russia will reorganize. Russia will reinforce. According to Ukrainian reserve officer and military analyst Andriy Kovalenko, Russia is currently conducting a large-scale rotation of forces in the Zaporizhzhia region and preparing for its spring 2026 offensive campaign, with the main emphasis on the Kostiantynivka and Pokrovsk directions in Donetsk. The rotation away from Zaporizhzhia is precisely what gave Ukraine the window to act in the first place. That window will not remain open forever. Ukraine now needs to complete mine-clearing operations across the 300 recaptured square kilometers. It needs to eliminate remaining Russian sabotage and reconnaissance groups operating in the liberated areas. It needs to fortify new defensive lines before Russian forces complete their rotation and are ready to push again. And it needs to continue disrupting Russian logistics deep enough behind the lines that any renewed offensive push pays a steep price before it even reaches the front. These are not hypothetical future challenges. They are urgent operational realities that Ukrainian commanders are managing right now, in real time, while simultaneously watching the diplomatic theater in Geneva. The strategic comparison that keeps coming up among serious military analysts is the Kharkiv counteroffensive of September 2022. Not in scale, the September 2022 operation was far larger in territorial terms, but in psychological impact on both sides and in the disruption to Russian planning and expectations, the Zaporizhzhia operation of February 2026 carries comparable weight. In September 2022, Ukraine demonstrated that Russia's seemingly unstoppable advance could be shattered by speed, surprise, and elite execution. In February 2026, Ukraine has demonstrated that even after 4 years of grinding war, even under diplomatic pressure to concede territory, even with depleted reserves and Western partners debating the limits of their support, Ukraine still retains the capacity to innovate, to deceive, to strike with precision, and to force the largest nuclear-armed power in the world into retreat. Russia is now in the position that military strategists describe as the most psychologically corrosive state for any armed force: strategic uncertainty. Moscow does not know where the next Ukrainian move will come from. It does not know which sector is being reinforced and which is being feinted. It has to disperse defensive resources across a front line that stretches for over 1,000 kilometers. It has to repair its communications architecture while simultaneously rotating forces and preparing for spring operations. It has to restore the morale of units that were advancing a month ago and are now explaining retreats to their commanders. And it has to do all of this while Russia's own propaganda machine maintains the fiction that everything is going according to plan. In modern warfare, that kind of institutional paralysis, that erosion of certainty and command coherence, is corrosive in a way that no single battle can be. It spreads through the ranks like a slow poison. It makes every commander hesitate before committing resources. It makes every decision slower and every error more likely. And in a war being fought at this tempo, hesitation costs lives and territory in equal measure. For now, the sky over Zaporizhzhia is Ukrainian blue. The flag still flies over the rooftops of the recaptured settlements. The 225th Assault Regiment is still pushing. The 475th's fiber-optic drones are still hunting. The Iron Falcon team is still striking deep. The Requiem group is still cutting supply lines. And across 300 recaptured square kilometers, Ukrainian soldiers are digging in, fortifying, and preparing for whatever Russia throws at them next. This war is far from over. The road ahead is brutal and deeply uncertain. Peace talks are grinding forward in Geneva without a breakthrough in sight. Russia still controls approximately a fifth of Ukrainian territory. The pressure on Kyiv to make concessions has never been greater. Western resolve is being tested in ways it has not been tested before, and the spring will bring new Russian pressure on the Donetsk front that will demand everything Ukraine has left. But if you want to understand where Ukrainian resolve comes from, look at what happened in Zaporizhzhia in February 2026. Look at the 225th Regiment clearing villages in rapid succession with near zero casualties. Look at the 475th using unjammable fiber-optic drones to carve corridors through Russian lines. Look at the 82nd and 95th Airborne pushing into gaps with the speed and violence of action that elite units train for their entire careers. Look at the Iron Falcon team striking command posts deep behind Russian lines, while the Requiem group severed the supply arteries that kept those positions alive. Look at the cyber units that turned 2,420 data packets into a communication blackout that cracked a Russian offensive wide open. These are not the actions of an army that is beaten. These are not the actions of a military that is running on empty. These are the actions of an army that is dangerous, adaptive, and far from done. The coming weeks will be critical in determining whether Ukraine can hold what it has taken, whether it can continue to disrupt Russian logistics before the spring offensive gets underway, and whether the Geneva talks produce anything beyond the diplomatic theater that has characterized every previous negotiation attempt. The front line remains dynamic. The active phase of the Zaporizhzhia operation is ongoing, and as Russia completes its rotation and prepares for its next push, every development in this region will carry consequences that extend far beyond the battlefield. So tell me what you think in the comments below. Do you believe Ukraine can hold the recaptured territory when Russia finishes its rotation? Can the momentum from Zaporizhzhia be sustained into the spring, while the diplomatic pressure in Geneva intensifies? And what does this operation tell us about the long-term trajectory of this war? Drop your analysis down there. This community consistently produces some of the sharpest thinking I have seen anywhere, and your perspective matters in a conversation this important. If this breakdown gave you something real to think about, hit subscribe and turn on notifications, because this front line is moving fast, and we will be here every time it does.